G'day everyone, we are going to be talking about the American intervention in Venezuela today, which means we are going to be showing footage from Operation Absolute Resolve. As such, some of the imagery in here may be considered as sensitive, though I have tried to keep it as PG as possible. But also due to this, I need to pad out the runtime so it's not shown in the first 30 seconds. So if you want to support the channel, you can follow me and pay $5 on Patreon to get access to the Discord, or use promo code JDAM for your next Gamer Subs order. Okay, I think that pushed me over 30 seconds. Yep, okay, it did. Video starts now.
¡Venga por mí! ¡Aquí lo espero en Miraflores! ¡No se tarde en llegar, cobarde!
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation.
Huh. Well, that was cool. You know, I thought that maybe, just maybe, after the insanity of 2025, multiple wars, the Trump regime Part 2 Electric Boogaloo, Iran, Israel, my dad dying, and a myriad of other geopolitical and military happenings, you'd hope that 2026 was going to be a calmer, more coherent experience. Yet, just like every year since we shot that damned gorilla, it's time for us to buckle the fuck up, because 2026 is starting with a bang, quite literally. So for those who slept through it and haven't checked their phones or the news in over a week, or are still blackout drunk trying to forget the absolutely moronic timeline that we live in, the United States carried out a special military operation to capture, abduct, or whatever you want to call it, and extract Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro from his high-security compound in the foothills of Venezuela's capital of Caracas. The operation was successful. In fact, it was astonishingly successful. To the extent that almost every professional and theorist who's looked at it is now calling it the finest operation in military history. No US fatalities, minimal collateral damage, and the precision elimination of almost exclusively military targets, primarily communications, air defenses, support facilities, barracks and armored vehicle storage, air bases along with their associated command and control nodes. Oh, and they also bombed the mausoleum of Hugo Chavez. Why? I don't know. Supposedly, there is a guard post around it with a limited air defense capability provided by manpads, but more likely it was a political statement and a bit of trolling. I hate to use the archaic internet term for the lols, yet it does seem to be the most accurate assessment. And it is, desecration of a grave aside, rather hilarious that the US taxpayer spent over $1 million just to make a point. Then again, this is the Trump administration we are talking about, so that is par for the course by now. Even so, though, given Hugo Chavez was a dictator, it was pretty funny. Naturally, however, I'm going to have to talk about it, given what happened, how it happened, and why, especially given the aviation focus of it all. But for those of you who just want the TLDR, here it is. How? 160th SAW and Delta Force did some certified gangster shit, grabbed Maduro at 1 AM, and bounced with no casualties. Why? Oil. Venezuela fell under the control of a populist, quasi-socialist government in the 1970s that nationalized the nation's oil reserves, which just so happened to be the largest oil fields in the Western Hemisphere. That kicked out America's oil companies, who naturally viewed this as stealing their assets, which, in the past 20 years, has gotten far more severe under Hugo Chavez and Maduro, who started leveraging the oil industry to support their dictatorship, as well as the entire economy, while undercutting US oil markets. This naturally leading to the inevitable Americans screaming, "Communism!" Eagle screeching, and now, after biding their time, this. There is of course also the factor that because of their communist nature, they were collaborating with China and Russia and therefore posed an existential threat in the US hemisphere. There you go, saved you half an hour. For more information, I recommend what I always recommend, and go grab a history book. However, as for the more detailed how and why in this specific operation, stick around. However, I will note, this is a developing story, events are still unfolding, and a lot of this will be speculation based on what we know. That said, I will do my best. Alrighty, here we go. At 22:46 Eastern Standard Time, January 2nd, 2025, President Trump gave the official authorization for Operation Absolute Resolve, a, quote, kinetic strike on the country of Venezuela, centered around the primary objective of capturing its president and dictator, Nicolas Maduro. US armed forces have spent the past 6 months concentrating assets in the region and conducting shaping operations via the seizure of Venezuelan oil tankers and the interdiction of alleged drug boats en route to the United States. These operations were carried out with apparently two objectives in mind. First, to psychologically prepare the US population for a direct strike against the Maduro regime with the goal of regime change, and second, put economic and diplomatic pressure on President Maduro to make concessions with the Trump administration regarding American interests in the region, hopefully to avoid it. Namely, control of the nation's oil reserves by US companies, including the restoration of their pre-1976 ownership and the cessation of drug-running operations by Venezuelan cartels, along with the cessation of agreements with potential foreign adversaries like China and Russia. Prior to the mission's authorization, over 150 US military aircraft, the USS Gerald Ford Strike Group, the USS Iwo Jima Amphibious Operations Group, and the US Joint Special Operations Command ship, the MV Ocean Trader, began staging in the waters and airspace north of Venezuela. The subunits involved in this operation that we've confirmed, or are highly likely to have been involved, are as follows. The 432nd Operations Group specialized in the operation of UCAVs and UAVs. The subunits assigned involved the 33rd and 44th Reconnaissance Squadrons, operating the RQ-170 Sentinel stealth drones. It is highly likely that they were the assets providing real-time ISR capability, information surveillance reconnaissance, for the operation. They also have a strike wing equipped with MQ-9 Reapers and other combat UAVs. The primary capability provided for this operation by Carrier Air Wing 8 is the Electronic Warfare and AWACS contingent, as both EA-18 Growlers and E-2 Hawkeyes were on station to provide jamming, seed, deed, and airborne early warning, as well as control for the strike. They are comprised of the VAQ-142 Grey Wolves operating EA-18Gs and the VAW-124 Bear Aces operating the E-2D. However, it has been confirmed that a number of regular F-18E and F Super Hornets also took part in the operation, having conducted some of the strikes or potentially serving as a reserve should the mission have gone sideways and started a pitched battle. As such, aircraft from the other squadrons aboard the Ford would have been in attendance. This includes the Tomcatters of VFA-31, the Raging Bulls of VFA-37, the Golden Warriors of VFA-87, and the Black Lions of VFA-213. 7th Bomb Wing United States Air Force is comprised of the 9th and 28th Bomb Squadrons operating the B-1B Lancer. It is unknown which aircraft from which squadron were involved in the operation. However, we know that between 2 to 4 aircraft were launched for staging over the Caribbean Sea on the afternoon of January 2nd. 1st Fighter Wing is the elite fighter formation of the United States Air Force. It is comprised of the 27th and 94th Fighter Squadrons operating the F-22 Raptor. They formed the primary air superiority component to protect against any intervention from the Venezuelan Air Force. The 43rd Air Mobility Operations Group operates C-130s in support of Joint Special Operations Command. Their aircraft were spotted on the flight line of NAS Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico. Their role is the transport of equipment and personnel. Their extended role in the operation is unknown. The 134th Fighter Squadron of the Vermont Air National Guard, the Green Mountain Boys, operate the F-35A. Their aircraft were spotted on the flight line at Roosevelt Roads Naval Air Station, and their likely role would be the utilization of their stealth capability to carry out strikes in contested airspace over Caracas, as well as supporting the F-22s in the counter-air role. 55th Wing are the ELINT and Electronic Warfare Specialists operating the RC-135 Rivet Joint. I don't know which squadron, nor where, when, or how they were involved. All we know is that their involvement was confirmed and essential. They were around somewhere, and they provided a crucial capability during the operation. But for the sake of my personal safety and not wanting to get raided by the Australian Federal Police on the behalf of the Pentagon, that's all I'm saying about them. The 55th Electronic Combat Group operate the EC-130H Compass Call, the electronic attack aircraft. Their involvement was confirmed and likely provided some of the primary cyber and electronic warfare attacks against the Venezuelan defenses. They are the only operators of this type, though again, where or how exactly they were involved, as with all electronic warfare and intel assets, I don't know, I'm not asking, and I don't want to know. VPU-2 are awesome. These guys are the shore-based Naval Special Operations Squadron that carry out covert intelligence gathering and high-risk maritime patrol. They operate the P-8 Poseidon, and like the other intel assets on the list, don't know, won't ask. But their role was most likely to monitor Venezuelan naval traffic, as well as any other civilian vessels in the area in case they posed a threat to the landing force or were about to get caught up in the strike. They would also provide some excellent ISR capability further out to sea. U.S. Air Force Pararescue, or the PJs. They're based out of Moody Air Force Base, and they offer emergency QRF support for medical emergencies in combat. They are some of the deadliest operators on the planet, and they work very closely with JSOC. Yet they have the best motto of all the US Armed Forces, in my opinion. These things we do, that others may live. As much as I hate to admit it, we can't give the traditional services all the glory. We have to give the Devil Dogs their due. The Vikings operate the F-35B, and the Scorpions operate Growlers. They provide the exact same capability as their US Air Force and United States Navy counterparts. FIB-8, as it's known, is the amphibious ready group built around the USS Iwo Jima, containing a full roster of support units serving and supporting the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, who, according to the Navy and Marine Corps, are trained to support and carry out special operations missions as part of both MARSOC and JSOC. Marine Corps F-35Bs, AH-1Z attack helicopters, and possibly CH-53 Sea Stallions were confirmed to have carried out operations in the region over Caracas. They also operate Ospreys and some absolute giga-chads in Harriers. If the 22nd MEU did put troops on the ground, which given the number of helicopters is a possibility, their role would have been to provide outer cordon security for the main force of Tier 1 operators carrying out the tactical yoinking. Speaking of which, the Nightstalkers need no introduction. They are the US Army's deadliest Uber drivers operating special variants of the US military's full roster of helicopters. The CH-47G, the MH-60 in multiple types including the Direct Action Penetrator, the incredibly badass MH-60M Assault Hawk, and of course, they are the only operators of the dreaded Killer Egg, aka the Little Bird. Their role in the mission was the deployment and extraction of the primary assault force. That being Delta Force. Do I really need to elaborate? You know who they are and what they do. They're the ones assigned to capture or kill high-value targets. Suffice to say, they are very, very good at it. And of course, if Nightstalkers and Delta are here, that just leaves the Rangers. And they're here to provide some extra manpower in the primary assault force. Delta isn't that big, so they need some backup. And as usual, they're on the 10-yard line leading the way. Am I right? Huh?
Pretty funny, huh?
As for all the other support assets involved, there would be no way to confirm them other than primary sources, and I guarantee we aren't going to get those. Suffice to say, there were at least 4 aerial refueling tankers operating over the Caribbean Sea, an EA-11 airborne command center, and a myriad of support units required to mount an operation of this size, including MQ-9 Reapers, battlefield UAVs, and there are even reports of loitering munitions being employed alongside long-range kamikaze drones. Suffice to say, there was a lot of hardware and personnel in the skies of Venezuela that night, a cool diagram of which you can see on screen. And of course, these efforts were augmented by an unknown number of CIA intelligence officers on the ground who have been gathering information regarding Maduro's pattern of movements, his location, and establishing human intelligence assets, including inside his personal staff, able to pinpoint his location during the raid. Planning for the operation is reported to have been in progress since the beginning of escalating hostilities between the United States and Venezuela since the Trump administration took office. The Tier 1 operators involved in the raid have been reportedly training up on an exact mock-up of President Maduro's compound for months prior to the mission. The sheer number of intelligence assets associated with this operation is immense. NSA and Space Force both played a decisive role, with satellite and SIGINT, to say nothing of the cyber and electronic warfare assets assigned in support of the, quote, kinetic action. Speaking of, let us return to the evening of January 2nd. After receiving the go-ahead from National Command Authority, United States forces on standby commenced the operation and moved to their initial points. Speculation, based on geolocated data, indicates the insertion force went feet dry over the mountainous and isolated coastline to the east of Caracas, flying at under 100 feet above sea level while utilizing various valleys and terrain features to mask their approach. At approximately 12:30 AM EST on January 3rd, 2025, various electronic warfare, cyber warfare, and strategic strike assets began targeting key military and infrastructure targets across Caracas. Power was cut off to various Venezuelan installations, causing blackouts among several parts of the city in order to provide cover for the infiltration force, while cyber assets disabled or digitally obliterated all communications. Approximately 10 minutes after that, precision-guided munitions began hitting various targets with a priority focus on air defense, potential quick reaction forces, and command infrastructure. The first major target hit was the Cerro de Volcan communications complex, housing all the major communication systems for both the federal government and the capital of Venezuela. It's located on the big mountain behind the city. Combine that with a full-scale electronic and cyber attack, this essentially shut down the ability of the Venezuelan military to actively respond. None of their command elements could even communicate with any of their units in the city. Immediately following this, multiple precision strikes took out various Russian-built air defense systems stationed around the region. 2 motorized Buk M2E launchers have been confirmed destroyed, one of which being based at Higuerote Airport 75 kilometers or roughly 35 miles east of Caracas, most likely neutralized to prevent it from targeting the helicopter infiltration taking place simultaneously to the west of the base. Numerous other impacts have been observed at this time, most likely against other air defense assets. The suspected types are S-125 Pechoras and S-300 SVs, both of which also purchased from Russia. At the same time, the primary naval base for Caracas, Miesta de Mamo and Port La Guaira, I'm sorry to you Spanish speakers in the audience, to the north of the city, had its storage warehouses on the main pier destroyed, the contents of which are unknown, but given the cook-offs we saw, they are speculated to be man-pads which could pose a threat during the exfil. Further strikes were detected at various air bases in the region, including El Libertador Air Base, Charval Air Base, and Barquisimeto Air Base. These bases house the majority of Venezuela's fighter, drone, and airlift capabilities. The targets struck in those locations and the battle damage assessments are fragmented at best. However, aside from a pair of Su-30s launched on a counter-air patrol at the beginning of the attack, no information is known about their potential shootdown or the destruction of aircraft on the ground. Later footage showed a squadron scramble at sunrise from El Libertador Air Base, suggesting the strike disabled their ability to launch or their command and control, rather than eliminating the aircraft themselves. Or it was a warning shot to advise them not to scramble. So most likely it was a hit of the headquarters building on the control tower, or they cratered the runway. If you ask me though, scrambling in an F-16A versus the inevitable swarm of F-22s and F-35s is something I'm not inclined to do after my runway got cratered by a Tomahawk, so, you know, I guess that makes sense. In any case, now in our timeline, the time is now approximately 12:50 AM Eastern Standard Time. Strikes intensify on the presidential palace and the main military base of Caracas, Fort Tiuna, home base of the 312th Armored Cavalry Squadron, Juan Pablo Ayala. Multiple impacts were seen at various points. The primary storage warehouse for their vehicles was hit, along with several other open-air shelters. These strikes were immediately followed by the 160th Direct Action Penetrators and AH-1Z Cobra gunships of the United States Marine Corps, interdicting potential quick reaction forces by absolutely annihilating any Venezuelan military equipment and personnel in the general vicinity, using Hydra rockets or APKWS as seen in the footage here. This prevented any reinforcements from moving to aid the dictator as the ground team approached their landing zones in and around Maduro's compound, located southeast of Fort Tiuna. The exact deployment of the team is unknown beyond their ultimate objective. However, available landing zones in the region include the baseball field to the north of the compound, which is directly beside the entrance to Venezuela's main underground bunker complex, which is suspected to be where Maduro attempted to flee to at the beginning of the operation. And of course, the roof of his compound itself. Helicopters of the 160th took fire from various small arms and manned portable air defense systems approaching the landing area, including footage of one Igla shoulder-fired missile inflicting damage on one of the attacking aircraft. However, countermeasure systems, Western build quality, and a touch of good luck kept them operational, and the aircraft continued on mission without hindrance. The continued survival of that very brave man is deemed unlikely, as General Dan Kane emphasized extensive self-defense return fire in the post-mission press conference. And indeed, the footage shows a rather prompt response confirming this, as immediately after you see the rocket fired, you start hearing the chatter of 30mm autocannons and various impacts at the source of the launch. So, yeah, it turns out he wasn't the main character after all. Thus, 160th SAW with Delta Force aboard approached the compound from the southeast over the outer suburbs of Caracas, using the mountains and valleys surrounding the city as terrain masking from air defense assets that they missed. Not that they missed any. Their infill route is estimated along these lines here, due to the primary source footage showing their flight path proceeding from right to left across frame, with the lights of downtown Caracas in the distance, which would put the city to the north of the camera's location. This corresponds to standard Special Operations rotary practice. Touchdown of the raid force was confirmed at exactly 1:01 AM Eastern Standard Time. Limited resistance was met, however it was completely ineffective. A member of Maduro's personal security detail was confirmed killed in the subsequent firefight, and almost certainly more. Several casualties among the raid force are reported, with 2 gunshot wounds and multiple shrapnel wounds. However, they were all successfully extracted and treated by pararescue during the exfil. Maduro and his wife were caught by complete surprise and apprehended, still in their pajamas and attempting to reach a secure safe room. Not that it would have helped, as the raid force is confirmed to have been equipped with heavy-duty breaching tools in the eventuality that they had. At this point, members of the FBI hostage rescue team out of Quantico, representing federal law enforcement, which deployed alongside Delta for this specific purpose, read them their Miranda rights and took them into custody on various conspiracy, drug, and terrorism charges. With the high-value targets secured, a second wave of strikes began, primarily carried out by escorting close air support to provide cover for the raid force's extraction. During these strikes, for reasons asserted to be military, although most likely political, the Mausoleum and Museum of Hugo Chavez was struck with a large munition and set ablaze. At this point, 160th SAW returned to the designated landing zones, retrieved the raid force and high-value targets, exfiltrating under the cover of support assets. Total time on the ground was under half an hour. The entire strike package ground team and escort force returned to feet wet over the Caribbean Sea at 3:29 AM Eastern Standard Time. Total operation duration from first contact to safe extraction, 2.5 hours, with no friendly fatalities. From there, the helicopter force returned aboard its launch point, the USS Iwo Jima, coordinating with JSOC command ship MV Ocean Trader. At which point, after a preliminary screening process, the HVTs were transported to Guantanamo Bay. From there, they were fully transferred from the military into federal law enforcement custody and placed aboard a 757-200 belonging to the Justice Department, registration N874TW, which transported them to Stewart Air National Guard Base, New York, and subsequently the New York Metropolitan Detention Center, which means Maduro, former dictator of Venezuela, is a potential cellmate of Luigi Mangione. And I don't care who you are, that's funny. In the period during transit, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi submitted an official indictment in the Southern District of New York with multiple charges, including narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices against the United States, which, in regard to that last part, is apparently due to the fact that Maduro is not officially recognized by the United States as the rightful leader of Venezuela, and as such, he is a co-conspirator with various South American drug cartels, most notably Tren de Aragua, Sinaloa, and the so-called imagined Cartel of the Suns. And as they are being charged with narcotics crimes, any possession of firearms in pursuit of such aims, regardless of context, is a felony. So because he was president of Venezuela, had private security and of course a military, while not being recognized as such and accused of running drugs, buying guns for his security detail in the military is classed as arming a cartel as part of a criminal conspiracy. Either that, or they are charging him under the National Firearms Act, which would be fucking hilarious. Man, you know what? I can't wait to see this court case, because this is gonna get wild. We've already seen the opening of the case, and it's crazy. We haven't had a trial this good since Mossad nabbed Eichmann. We just have to make sure it isn't someone like Ben Shapiro or Tucker Carlson who gets the publishing rights for the book, because Hannah Arendt deserves far better company. And speaking of the Eichmann kidnapping, that bookends nicely to the summary of the raid itself. This operation will go down in history, regardless of the moral, geopolitical, and legal questions it poses, as the single greatest special operations mission in the history of modern warfare. Perhaps the greatest achievement in the history of warfare itself. From the St. Nazaire raid in Operation Chariot, to the heroism displayed in Black Hawk Down's Operation Gothic Serpent, in terms of audacity, efficiency, and professionalism, this is the finest display of soldiering I've ever seen, and perhaps the world has ever seen. An operation only made possible by supreme professional excellence on the part of the intelligence services, electronic and cyber warfare specialists, as well as the hundreds of aviators who donned their flight suits that night. No American fatalities were suffered during the course of the raid, and total casualties killed and wounded number under 100 on the ground, 90% of them being military casualties. In fact, I think there were only 2 civilian casualties reported, and they were accidents. And those casualty figures include 32 Cuban military personnel deployed to Fort Tiana and around 37 Venezuelans. Given the amount of ordnance expended and the intended objective, as well as the overall operational footprint this mission had, this outcome is about as good as it gets. This was surgical. It doesn't get better than this. Yet now comes the hard part. All of this was just the what and the how, leaving only the most important questions left. Why and what now? Well, we might as well start with the why, and the main reason is obvious to anyone who's ever read a book or seen the news. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on the planet by a significant margin. And ever since the nationalization of Venezuela's oil reserves in the 1970s, the United States, and more importantly its fossil fuel lobbyists, have taken a very dim view of the Venezuelan government. A view which only got worse ever since the notionally socialist governments of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro took power. Initially, the decision to nationalize the Venezuelan oil industry went well, as the state concern, much like the other central natural resource economies like Norway, operated independently in cooperation with private companies, while simultaneously providing funds directly to the state coffers. ExxonMobil wasn't happy about it, but since when are American oil companies ever happy with profit sharing? Even so, they still got a reasonable cut, and the other big companies like BP went along quite happily, as their return on investment was still excellent. It was a win all round, if a bit irritating to Washington. Then, suddenly, communism! Okay, not actual communism. Like always, it's some corrupt strongman who claims to be one, while starting a massive criminal extortion racket which is now synonymous with the term communism itself. The Chavez government began a massive program of expropriation against all oil concerns in Venezuela, both private and public alike. He intentionally integrated it from the top down with the government while suppressing any and all political opposition, essentially turning the entire oil industry into his political party's, and by extension his, own financial support mechanism. Using this as a crutch, he enacted populist social policies funded by the oil industry to garner support in order to retain power, while simultaneously siphoning off billions of dollars in corruption. The oil industry, much like Gazprom in Russia, became the primary posting for government officials loyal to the regime, allowing them to embezzle state funds and get rich at the cost of the Venezuelan people. In fact, to this day, Venezuela is ranked among the most corrupt countries in the world. Yet all of this is perfectly fine. I mean, just look at the Gulf states. They're in a similar boat in terms of corruption. I mean, you mean to tell me that Qatar got the World Cup fairly? I mean, it's all good as long as the price of oil stays steady. Except then the late 90s happened, followed immediately by 9/11 and the War on Terror. Saudi Arabia massively expands production along with the Gulf states in the aftermath of US intervention in the Middle East. Russia opens trade with the EU in a period of cooling tensions. Different times, am I right? And then all of a sudden, the oil price crashes. Thus, Chavez and later Maduro start driving the oil industry to overproduce without maintaining its infrastructure or investing in it, essentially extracting everything they can with no sustainable return. Corruption and nepotism run rife through the economy, cartels and organized crime start making serious inroads, one thing leads to another, and inevitably, like all so-called Marxist-Leninist nations before it, the economy implodes, people start rioting, resulting in excessive state violence against average Venezuelans, causing a massive humanitarian as well as a refugee crisis. And in an effort to stop this from happening, they do the only thing they can do: nationalize literally every inch of the oil industry still in private hands to try and save themselves, while whoring themselves out to any foreign power hostile to the US that will listen, which A, didn't work, B, caused massive inefficiencies leading to productivity dropping even further, and C, it had the same result as General Noriega nationalizing the Panama Canal. The Americans were not happy. But they were kind of busy with some guy called, what was it, Osama bin something? I don't know, some guy. So resources and domestic support for some good old-fashioned Reagan-era Monroe Doctrine shenanigans was not forthcoming. Not that they didn't try. The Bush administration hit them hard in the press, but it just didn't stick. Now, fast forward a few years, if only there was a president who didn't have to worry about a war on terror, and had an ultra-nationalist, jingoistic, militarist platform that ignores all international norms to support it. Enter President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. After taking office in his first term, he ramped up sanctions against the Venezuelan state oil and energy concerns while hitting the nation itself with immense diplomatic pressure. However, as we know, he still had a divided party and a hostile Congress to contend with. This time, though, he has neither of those things. The GOP has been thoroughly converted to MAGA loyalists, as has the government. Furthermore, Project 2025 policies have been pursued to concentrate power in the executive branch, forestalling any potential opposition to the current administration's policies. This, combined with his control over the Supreme Court, grants Trump near limitless latitude with both foreign and domestic policy. And given the interest at play in this operation, namely that of the oil lobby, which Trump is heavily funded by due to his opposition to the Green New Deal and his so-called drill baby drill platform, removing the government of Venezuela and replacing it with someone more friendly to US oil companies is a primary objective. It also helps that the government is notionally communist, and as such it plays well to his base, as well as the few holdouts in the traditional conservative camp. Pretty much every American on the right side of the aisle is perfectly happy and in fact demands some good old-fashioned commie killing. It also does a lot to shore up support among Latin diaspora voters and conservative hawks like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is suspected of being one of the main internal backers of the operation, as well as expanded operations against Cuba. The clean, effective, and profitable nature of the operation acts as both a show of force to South America and the world, as well as shoring up domestic support ahead of this year's midterm elections. As Margaret Thatcher and old mate George W. can attest, nothing saves a failing right-wing government like a successful war. Though at least this time it is rather refreshing that we aren't bothering to play the dog and pony show. Although, that being said, they're still making a big deal about fentanyl and cocaine being weapons of mass destruction, so I guess there is an Iraq parallel there. But in a rather shocking case of transparency, in his post-mission press conference, Donald Trump explicitly cited American oil companies as key players in his decision, and that their return to Venezuela was a strategic goal of this operation, something he confirmed by agreeing to meet senior American oil executives as I record this. He also announced that he'd reached a deal with the vice president of Venezuela, which included the immediate transfer of between 30 to 50 million barrels of refined oil. So, you know, I guess he's making his point. We're not even hiding it. Also, Exxon and BP are up 10 points on the stock market this week, so take that as you will. But it has to be said that oil isn't the only factor. It's one of many. Venezuela had a lot of Russian-built air defenses. Keyword being had, because they just got smoked by the boys in VAQ 142 and VAQ 132. Also, side note, I just want to say, of all the people getting their flowers for this operation, and they do deserve it, all of you better put some goddamn respect down for the Growler crews. All these hype edits I keep seeing online, CAG this, CAG that. How about you CAG the commander of the air group and catch this harm? Emit and die, bitch. Those Navy weasels with their electronic warfare and SAM suppression operations are the real heroes here. And for the record, yes, Wild Weasels are my favourite unit in the Air Force, and it's also my preferred mission to fly in DCS. Why do you ask? YGBSM, baby! Anyway, it's not exactly a coincidence that Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro are very friendly with the full roster of known American adversaries. The oil and energy companies under their control were vital in assisting Russia to bypass sanctions. In fact, they were so good at it, they provided the same service to Iran. Well, at least they did, until the Nightstalkers proved they are in fact the main characters, because not content with seizing a head of state on the weekend, during the week they decided to seize a Russian oil tanker sailing from Venezuela in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And that's not even beginning to talk about the Coast Guard, who showed up and proved why they are secretly the best branch of the armed forces with their epic takedowns of Venezuelan tankers trying to bust sanctions. But more than that, much like the Cuban alliance with Grenada that prompted an immediate US response, Venezuela has had a long-standing military alliance with Russia over the past 30 years. Ever since Hugo Chavez took power, Russia has been the primary arms supplier to the Venezuelan regime, including S-300s, Su-30s, modernized T-72s, the whole shebang. More than that, they have directly cooperated with the Putin regime in all spheres of military operations, including joint exercises, the basing of nuclear-capable Russian supersonic bombers, namely the Tu-160 Blackjack, and of course, both material and political support to their ongoing special military operation in Ukraine. This goes so far that 2 Colombian volunteers in the Ukrainian Foreign Legion were seized and then extradited to Russia when their plane stopped in Caracas for fuel on their way home. Despite the Trump administration's ongoing efforts to improve relations with Russia, they still pose a major strategic threat to US interests, especially in the aforementioned energy sector. So cutting them out of the Venezuelan oil market and neutralizing a key source of hard currency via arms sales is a sound geopolitical move. But Russia isn't the main target of this on the macro scale, despite appearances. Oh no. As you can probably guess, given that there was a large diplomatic delegation present at the time of the raid, and the fact that they are the major US adversary, the real concern is China. Also, can you imagine being the station chief at the Chinese embassy in Caracas? Hello, have you spoken to Maduro about a better deal on oil imports? About that, Comrade Chairman Xi, we have run into diplomatic complications. China and Venezuela have had a long relationship since the Chavez regime took power, given their ideological similarity. Comrades are comrades and all that. However, more importantly, was China's business relationship. China has been, throughout the disaster that is the socialist government of Venezuela, the country's biggest creditor. Without Chinese financial support, the Venezuelan economy wouldn't have stayed merely at collapsing, it would have utterly imploded. The main reason the oil industry was forced to operate beyond its means, and without proper infrastructure, is because they needed to service their debts to the PRC, which were and remain extensive. But it doesn't just stop there. China has been slowly integrating Venezuela into the Belt and Road Initiative, financing housing projects, starting a jointly owned state railway corporation to support the expansion of the rail network, a network they'd use to support mining operations also financed by them in the north of the country, for all of Venezuela's myriad of rare minerals. Then of course there is the oil dimension, which includes the construction and operation of new refineries exclusively owned and used by the Chinese. They even provide support for the development of an independent Venezuelan satellite network launched from Chinese spaceflight facilities. In fact, over 500,000 Chinese citizens live and work in Venezuela since 2020. I mean, just looking at it, the collaboration between the two countries is truly insane, with over 430 bilateral agreements in every sector of the economy having been signed since 1999. This goes to the extent that most of the buildings in Fort Tijuana destroyed during the raid to seize Maduro were built by Chinese companies with Chinese funds. Naturally, with all this investment in Venezuela and through them, Latin America in general, China is making serious inroads into developing a community of nations, if not friendly with them, are at least beholden to them via debt entrapment and economic dependency. And in Venezuela, they have an ideologically compatible anti-American ally who sits on the world's largest oil reserves. Should Chinese influence expand, which no doubt given their diplomatic mission was in town during the raid it was intended to, that very well could lead to that insane conspiracy theory of a giant Chinese army hiding close to America's borders, concealed by the deep state, to actually be real. It's just instead of Canada, they're based in Venezuela. And given the gigantic strides the Chinese military has made in the past 20 years, the J-20 long-range stealth air superiority fighter, the new PLAN fleet, and their hypersonic anti-ship missile capability, makes the idea of a potential Chinese basing operation in Venezuela exceptionally alarming for the Pentagon. Much like the Soviet Union in the past, the theory was that the big red menace was always an ocean and a continent away. America achieves its overwhelming conventional military victories due to its expeditionary nature. Their logistics and force structure operate on the idea that we go to hit the enemy first so they can't hit us. If that changes and the homeland can be struck with impunity via conventional means, that changes the threat assessment entirely. As such, should that eventuate, you will very quickly find yourself getting cubed, grenaded, or in this case, just caused. As for all the other hostile nations involved, such as Iran, the same logic applies, just to a far lesser degree, with the exception of sanction busting and drug running. However, despite that being their official casus belli, given the activities of American intelligence agencies in South America and Afghanistan regarding drugs, not to mention Trump just pardoned the former president of Honduras for his drug crimes, that really doesn't hold water with anyone other than the hardcore MAGA faithful, and the administration needing to keep on the straight and narrow by maintaining appearances. Although, what few appearances they bother to keep these days anyway. As with all things in geopolitics, you could dissect each factor of this situation into a million PhD level studies with a scope far beyond this short YouTube video. And people have. And of course, there are a million other smaller factors that also play into those decisions. Yet most of them stem from those two major concerns: hostile powers and energy resources, military threats, and money. The two oldest problems any superpower has to contend with. Jump in a time machine and go ask the Roman Senate about Carthage, and you're going to get similar answers. Which leaves the final component of this video. What now? And aside from Trump making boisterous claims about, "We're gonna run Venezuela now, folks, it's gonna be us, we're gonna run it," aside from that nonsense, the answer to this question is simple. I have no fucking idea, and neither does anyone else. Not even the Trump administration or the Venezuelan government knows what to do. We have no idea what's going to happen. And that's the problem with regime changes. While you may have a plan in place and a general idea of what you want to do, there are absolutely no guarantees in any of it. I know that's irritating to hear from a breakdown video, but it has to be said because, quite frankly, the entire situation is in chaos even almost a week later. It could change before this video goes live or just an hour after and render all of this discussion pointless. Regardless, there are three major outcomes I think likely, ranked from most likely to least. First is a government formed by the deputy leader, now president, Delcy Rodriguez. She is the former head of the Bolivarian Intelligence Agency, or the Venezuelan KGB, former foreign minister, and the former finance minister. She leads a faction in the current ruling United Socialist Party of Venezuela, similar to that of Putin in the early days of the Russian Federation. As finance minister and head of intelligence, she has a close relationship with Venezuela's oligarchs in the Fede Camaras. Again, I'm sorry to Spanish speakers, my pronunciation is awful. The Venezuelan Chamber of Commerce is what they actually are. While she herself is the daughter of one of the founding fathers of Venezuela's socialist movement, she is the minister who stopped Venezuela from imploding completely during their financial crisis, and is also the leading figure most likely to cooperate with the Venezuelan bourgeoisie. The reason I think she is the most likely to come out on top is for the same reasons Putin did. She knows all the right people, she has the experience, and more importantly, she has the leverage and the money. Furthermore, she's not beholden to ideological constraints or the cult of personality image. She is a technocrat, and by all appearances, relatively popular in all the right places. Immediately after Maduro got ousted, she was on the phone to Marco Rubio in minutes, calling for a calm and peaceful solution, which, when you take into account her positions on, and I'm paraphrasing her here, leveraging private enterprise to bring out Venezuela's true potential, this likely means she will maintain the original regime, keep all the infrastructure in place, use her influence with the oligarchs and intelligence organs to retain hold on power, and ease the Venezuelan economy into a more modern version of perestroika, while giving the American oil consortiums everything they want to avoid getting Panama'd, as we've already seen with their agreement with Donald Trump with the 30 to 50 million barrels of oil. If she can balance all of this and keep the people in line, she will maintain order and stability, which is always better for business. However, the reason I'm likening her to Gorbachev and Putin is because she isn't the only one who has a career at stake, and if she's not careful, the Soviet parallels won't stop at economic reforms. Second is the Chauvinista faction united behind Diosdado Cabello, the interior minister, and widely considered to be the most powerful man in Venezuela besides Maduro. He's the guy who currently controls the security services, has ties with the defense minister and the army, but perhaps most importantly, he was the president of the National Assembly and the former vice president back in the day, and when he was the ideological enforcer. He has control of all the ideologues, the collectivas, the socialist militias, the organized crime network, and all the other stuff. He's also implicated in all the major narcotic smuggling rings the Americans are complaining about, and he also played a role in every major insurrectionary action taken by Hugo Chavez's movement during their rise to power. He has contacts throughout the media, the oligarchs, and all the grassroots political organizations across the country. He is a die-hard Yankee go-home type, and should he feel himself threatened, or find the opportunity to advance himself to the top job, he may very well take it. Then again, as we've seen in recent days where he's pledged loyalty to the current government, he may just do the smart thing and embezzle a shitload of drug money and then hide in Switzerland. Whatever he decides to do, when rumors of a coup began circulating after the Venezuelan palace guard started shooting at their own drones, and then at each other in a panic, thinking the Americans had returned to destroy them, the person everyone suspected of launching a coup was him. So we shall have to wait and see. As I said, he's pledged loyalty to the new regime, but, well, we know how that goes in authoritarian governments. And of course, there is the last and the most problematic option. Third, the opposition movement and a potential civil war. This is the group notably led by Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Machado. The Trump administration, though probably due to Trump himself considering her a loser rather than an initiative from the State Department, has soured on supporting her due to her lack of institutional and political support. There's also a rumor that because she got the Nobel Peace Prize instead of Trump, he's angry about it, but to be honest, I think that's just tabloids. While she and other exiled opposition leaders are expected to return in the wake of Maduro's seizure by the Americans, should they do so, I can't imagine the regime will turn around and say all is forgiven. Especially as both leaders of the other factions are spooks with links to the oligarchs and apparently are now working together. Hell, the opposition is so fragmented, one faction said Maduro sold his friends out and the Spec Ops raid was a pre-planned extraction, accusing everyone, including Trump, of fraud and collaboration. If, as expected, the opposition movement disintegrates on contact and President Rodriguez offers an amnesty for the neolibs who want to play ball with her Make Venezuela China gambit, as long as they get rich, of course, then things will just keep on trucking. But if the movement survives and tries to get into power via elections or via US backing, the only likely outcome is the PSUV immediately rigs those elections or leverages their militias and the cartels to engage in massive amounts of street violence, potentially kicking off a civil war, or in the least likely scenario, a full-scale US proxy war intervention like Libya, with the opposition being supported by the Green Berets and a shitload of air power. However, I don't think the American public would go for that, even with the jingoism in full swing like it is now. Still, there could of course be the wildcard option and the Americans go full send anyway, or the oil companies become a gigantic East India trading company with PMCs. Just imagine, Blackwater acting like the East India Trading Company with oil cartels. Now that would be something to see. Absolutely awful and start a humanitarian crisis, but it's not off the table. As for all the other contingencies, I have no idea. As I said, the world of geopolitics is so nebulous and confusing, literally anything could happen, despite what the nothing ever happens crowd will tell you. The only thing I will say is this, and consider this my editorial and my personal opinion, and my official statement on the matter. As it is with Ukraine, the focus should not be on Trump. It shouldn't be on Zelensky, it shouldn't be on Putin, and it shouldn't be on Maduro. It shouldn't be on any of this nonsense. The focus, in my view, should be on the Venezuelan people. They have suffered under a dictator and they are now rid of him. Except now they are staring down a potential civil war, combined with, and there really is no other way of putting it, a return to the 19th century era of wanton American imperialism. The removal of Maduro is, in my opinion, a good thing, and as far as the operation goes, it was the most efficient and professional operation I've seen in my lifetime. Minimal to no civilian casualties, there were only 2 that we know of. Under 100 military casualties, most of which being Cubans who shouldn't have even been there. and no American casualties besides the few that were hospitalized. It went as well as it could have gone. However, it does set a dangerous geopolitical precedent. This is unheard of in the global order, and now essentially transforms the world into a pure might makes right philosophy. Now, in reality, it's always been that way, but we have monitored and adhered to social norms in the international community for a long time. That's why the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was so bad. Yet now, that seems to have broken the ice. What's to stop China from invading Taiwan? At this point, nothing. And I expect they're going to do it anyway. And building on that, I have to make this clear. I am under absolutely no illusion that Trump, or indeed the US government in general, gives a single shit about the Venezuelan people. They are there to serve American interests. And if starting a civil war in their country while flooding PMCs in to protect their oil fields and drop gas prices is what they think the best move is for them, that's exactly what they'll do, and to hell with the hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans that will die as a result of that. This is a purely cynical Machiavellian geopolitical move, which they are also going to use to shore up their electoral support in a failing administration during the midterms. It may seem like an archaic term, but this is imperialism. It is a return to the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century. But I do have to say this, and it's very ironic given that we are talking about a Latin American communist state in the context of the US government overthrowing its leadership. I'm going to quote Leon Trotsky. The ends justify the means, as long as something justifies the ends. I hope, I pray to God and our Savior Jesus Christ that the removal of Maduro provides a democratic, or failing that, a revolutionary opening for the people of Venezuela to have their own, for lack of a better term, Maidan movement. A way to rid themselves of their dictatorial regime while preserving their independence and sovereignty against predatory American corporations, and predatory Chinese and Russian ones for that matter. But with the United States seemingly returning to its old ways of the United Fruit Company, and the regime rushing to stabilize itself while sucking up to the State Department, I have my doubts. Yet, all that being said, to quote another even cringier reference, rebellions are built on hope, and so hope against all odds, I shall. Venezuela libre, and I'll see you all next time.